The sun of late summer, a relentless hammer of white gold, beat down on the dusty main street of Harmony Creek. It was the kind of heat that baked the promises out of the very air, leaving behind a shimmering haze that distorted the familiar shapes of the false-fronted buildings. Dust, fine as powdered bone, coated everything: the water trough, the hitching posts, the broad leaves of the cottonwoods that offered the only real sanctuary from the glare. The year was 1887, and the afternoon was lazy, with a silence broken only by the buzz of a persistent horsefly and the distant, rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer. On the sun-warped planks of the train station platform, Luke Harland stood with a patience that had been forged over 30 years of suns like this one. He leaned against a support post, one booted foot crossed over the other, his tall frame casting a long, sharp shadow. The brim of his sweat-stained Stetson was pulled low, shielding eyes the color of a twilight sky from the oppressive brightness. Those eyes, though, weren't looking at the town. They were fixed on the twin steel rails that sliced through the prairie, vanishing into a point of shimmering heat in the east. He wasn't waiting for a person. A man learns not to wait for people. People leave, or they change, or they die. The land, the seasons, the work, those were the things that remained. Luke was waiting for a shipment, 300 pounds of rock salt, ordered all the way from the mines in Kansas, for the cattle at Timber Ridge Ranch. It was a simple, practical errand, the kind that made up the architecture of his days. It was a chore that required nothing from him but his presence and the strength to load the heavy sacks onto his wagon, and that suited him just fine. The sound came first as a faint vibration through the soles of his boots. A low hum that grew into a rumble felt deep in his chest. Then, the lonely cry of the steam whistle, a mournful sound that echoed across the vast, empty plains. It was a sound that always, unfailingly, pulled at a thread of memory buried deep inside him. 7 years. 7 years since he'd last stood on this very platform, watching that same train or one just like it pull away, carrying with it everything he had thought his life was going to be. He had been 23 then, a boy who masqueraded as a man, with nothing to his name but a strong back, a stubborn heart, and a parcel of land that was more rock than soil. His hands, now calloused and scarred from 1,000 labors, had been clenched into useless fists at his sides. He remembered the feeling of the rough wool of his shirt against his skin, the frantic, helpless pounding of his own heart. He had stood there, frozen, as the train gathered speed, watching a face in a window grow smaller and smaller, a pale oval of grief framed by dark hair, until it was swallowed by the distance and the dust. He had not made a sound. He had not run after the train. He had not cried out her name. What would have been the use? Her father, Marcus Duval, the most prosperous merchant in Harmony Creek, had stood not 10 feet away, his face a mask of grim satisfaction. His 2 hired men, burly and impassive, flanked him like stone bookends. They had made their point the night before in the stables behind the Duval Emporium, a point delivered with fists and the hard toe of a boot that had left Luke with 2 cracked ribs and a split lip that took a month to heal. The message was clear: a penniless ranch hand was not to trifle with the daughter of a man of means. Luke pushed himself off the post, the wood warm against his back. The memory was like a ghost limb. He knew it was gone. But some days, it ached with a phantom pain so real it could steal his breath. He rolled his shoulders, a habit he developed to work out the stiffness of long days in the saddle, but it did little to ease the tension that had settled there. The train was a black serpent now, growing larger, belching smoke that smudged the perfect, cloudless blue of the sky. He could hear the chuffing of the engine, the squeal of steel on steel. He gave a slow, deliberate look around the platform. Old Mr. Henderson, the station master, emerged from his office, wiping his spectacles on a surprisingly clean handkerchief. A few other folks were scattered about a rancher's wife with 2 young children in tow, likely meeting her husband. A pair of prospectors, their face etched with the sun and failed hopes, probably heading further west. It was the usual unremarkable collection of humanity that the 3:15 train brought and took away. Luke's life, in the 7 years since that day, had become a testament to hard work and silence. The rocky parcel of land had become Timber Ridge, a respectable spread with a good-sized herd of Hereford cattle. The small cabin he'd built with his own hands now had 2 additions and a sturdy porch. He had a friend, a good one, in Diego, his foreman, a man who understood the language of unspoken things. Luke was respected in Harmony Creek. People called him Mr. Harland. They tipped their hats. He paid his bills on time, dealt fairly, and kept his own counsel. They saw a man who had made something of himself. They did not see the hollow space that had been carved out of him on this platform 7 years ago. He had never sought out another woman. It wasn't a conscious vow, not a dramatic, self-pitying pledge. It was simply a matter of fact. Courting required a kind of hope he no longer possessed. It required conversations about the future, and his future had become a series of seasons, of calving and branding and driving the herd to market. It was a full life, a good life, he told himself. But it was a life lived in monochrome. Eleanor had been the color. He remembered her not as the heartbroken girl in the train window, but as she was under the shade of the great aspen grove down by the creek, the place they had claimed as their own. Her father had sent her back east for schooling, to fill her head with poetry and art and manners, to make her a lady. And it had worked. She was a lady, but she had a wild streak that called to the untamed parts of him. She would read to him from books with worn leather covers, her voice a soft melody against the rustle of the aspen leaves. He, who could barely scrawl his own name, would listen, captivated, not always by the words, but by the light in her eyes as she spoke them. "Hope is the thing with feathers," she'd read one afternoon, her head resting on his shoulder, the scent of lavender and sunshine in her hair. That perches in the soul. He hadn't understood what it meant then. He understood it now. He understood that the thing with feathers had flown from his soul that day the train left, and it had never returned. They had made plans, of course, foolish, youthful plans whispered in the near darkness. They were going to run away. He would sell his small piece of land, and they would go west to California or Oregon. Somewhere no one knew them. Somewhere a man's worth wasn't measured by the coin in his pocket, but by the strength in his hands. They would build a life that was theirs alone. But her father had found out. Luke never knew how. A nosy servant, a misplaced letter. It didn't matter. The discovery had led to the confrontation in the stables, and the next morning she was gone, sent back east again, this time to Charleston, to live with a stern, watchful aunt. For her own good, her father had announced publicly, to protect her from a disastrous mistake. One letter had made it through, not from her, but from a young housemaid named Sarah, who had slipped it to Diego at the market a month after Eleanor left. The note was scrawled on a scrap of paper, the words hurried and smudged. "She made me promise to tell you." It read, "They watch her every move. She is not allowed to write. She said to tell you. I am not allowed to love you, but I have not stopped." He had kept the scrap of paper. It was folded into a small, tight square in the back of a drawer in his cabin, tucked inside an old, empty tin of tobacco. Sometimes, late at night, when the loneliness was a physical weight in the room, he would take it out and read the words until they blurred. It was the only proof he had that what they'd shared had been real. For 7 years, it had been all he had. The train was screeching now, a deafening protest of metal as it slowed, steam hissing from its iron belly like a great, tired beast. It shuddered to a halt, the passenger cars lining up with the platform, the freight cars stretching further down the track. Doors opened. The rancher's wife rushed forward into the arms of a dusty, smiling man. The 2 prospectors shouldered their meager belongings and shuffled toward the saloon, their thirst almost visible in the air around them. Luke ignored them all. His gaze went to the freight car, the fourth one back. He watched as the heavy door was slid open by two men from the inside. He just wanted his salt. He wanted to load his wagon, drive the long, quiet road back to Timber Ridge, eat the simple meal Diego would have left for him, and fall into the dreamless sleep of the physically exhausted. That was the rhythm of his life, and he clung to it. He took a step forward, ready to hail the freight men, but a movement from the corner of his eye caught his attention. A passenger was disembarking from the first-class car, the one reserved for those with the money for velvet seats and cleaner windows. A porter in a crisp uniform was carefully handing down a handsome leather valise. Then, a woman stepped down onto the platform. She was not the sort of woman who usually got off the train in Harmony Creek. Her traveling dress was the color of a summer dusk, a deep, tasteful blue, impeccably tailored. It was a city dress, made of fine fabric that wouldn't be found in Duval's Emporium. A fashionable hat adorned with a simple ribbon was pinned to a cascade of dark hair, which was swept up in an elegant style that exposed the graceful line of her neck. She moved with a poise and a confidence that set her apart from the sun-beaten, practical women of the territory. Luke's feet stopped moving. His breath hitched in his throat. It was a passing resemblance. He told himself, a trick of the light, of a heart that had never quite given up its ghost. There were many women in the world with dark hair and a slender build. She turned from thanking the porter, her gloved hands taking the handle of her valise. She stood for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the brutal sunlight, her gaze sweeping across the small, familiar tableau of the station. It was a calm, appraising look. It passed over the station master, the small family, the dusty street beyond. And then her eyes found him. Time did not stop. The world did not fall silent. The blacksmith's hammer still rang in the distance. The horsefly still buzzed near his ear. But for Luke Harland, everything contracted to the space between them. The 7 years, the lonely nights, the back-breaking work, the wall he had so carefully built around his heart, it all dissolved into nothing. Her face was different, yet utterly the same. The girlish softness was gone, replaced by the elegant planes and shadows of a woman. There were lines of experience around her eyes and mouth that hadn't been there before, but the eyes themselves, they were the same deep, intelligent brown, the color of rich earth after a rain, and they were looking directly at him. He saw the flicker of recognition, the slight, sharp intake of breath she tried to hide. He saw the 7 years of their separation reflected in their depths. He saw the girl he'd loved under the aspens and the woman she had become. The name was a whisper in his own mind, a word he hadn't allowed himself to speak aloud in years. Eleanor. He knew, with a certainty that was as terrifying as it was absolute, that the simple, predictable rhythm of his life had just been shattered. The train had arrived, and it had brought more than his salt. It had brought back the one person on earth who held the power to save him or to break him all over again. For a long moment, the world was a painting, and Luke Harland was pinned in its center. The heat, the noise, the very scent of dust and coal smoke, it all faded to a distant hum. There was only the woman in the dusk blue dress and the 20 yards of sun-bleached platform that separated them. His mind, usually so steady and practical, refused to work. It stuttered, trying to reconcile the image before him with the ghost he had carried for 7 years. The ghost had been a girl of 18, all raw emotion and secret smiles, dressed in simple calico. This was a woman, composed and elegant, her posture speaking of a world of drawing rooms and paved streets, a world he couldn't begin to imagine. But the eyes were the same, in their brown depths. He saw an impossible bridge across time, and it was a bridge he was terrified to cross. Eleanor held his gaze. There was no surprise in hers, only a calm, profound stillness. He saw now that her initial sweep of the platform had not been idle curiosity. It had been a search. She had been looking for him. The thought sent a jolt through his system. a confusing mix of terror and a wild, long-forgotten flicker of hope. He felt his hands, calloused and thick, clench into fists at his sides, the knuckles white. It was the same helpless gesture he'd made 7 years ago as her train pulled away. Then, she moved. It was a small, deliberate inclination of her head, a nod. It wasn't the warm greeting of an old friend, nor the shy acknowledgement of a former sweetheart. It was something else entirely. A simple, undeniable statement of fact. Asterisk, I am here. You are there. I see you. The gesture broke the spell that had held him motionless. Air rushed back into his lungs with a ragged gasp he hadn't realized he was holding. His heart, which had seemed to stop, began to hammer against his ribs with a frantic, painful rhythm. He should say something. He should call her name. He should walk toward her, or turn and walk away. He should do asterisk something asterisk. But his boots felt as though they were nailed to the planks, and his tongue was a leaden weight in his mouth. The name he had whispered to himself in the darkest hours of the night, 1,000 times over, now lodged in his throat, unable to form. Asterisk Eleanor. Asterisk. He could only stare, a statue carved from disbelief, while the life of the town began to stir around their silent confrontation. Old Mr. Henderson, the station master, was the first to notice. He had been shuffling toward the freight cars, clipboard in hand. But the tableau on the platform, the tall, unmoving cowboy and the impeccably dressed lady, was unusual enough to make him pause. He squinted, pushing his spectacles higher on his nose, his brow furrowed in concentration. He'd seen nearly every soul in Harmony Creek come and go from this station for 40 years. His memory was a ledger of faces. He tilted his head, his gaze flicking from Eleanor to Luke and back again. A slow dawn of recognition broke across his weathered features. His mouth opened slightly, forming a silent, "Oh." He knew that story. Everyone knew that story. A few feet away, Martha Gable, whose husband owned the livery stable and who herself was the unofficial proprietor of all town gossip, had been waiting to pick up a parcel. She saw the fancy woman get off the train and her interest was immediately piqued. A new face was a rare and delicious commodity. But then she saw who the woman was looking at, and how Luke Harland was looking back, and her sharp eyes narrowed. She had a memory for faces that rivaled the station master's, and an intuition for drama that was second to none. She craned her neck, her lips pursed. It couldn't be. After all this time, Marcus Duval's daughter, the one he'd shipped off east like a misaddressed package. Her hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp, but her eyes, wide and glittering with excitement, missed nothing. Eleanor seemed oblivious to the growing attention, or perhaps she simply chose to ignore it. Her focus remained on Luke. She saw his shock, the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his hands were clenched. She saw the 7 years etched on his face, the new lines fanning from the corners of his eyes, the hard-won maturity in the set of his jaw. He was no longer the boy she had loved, but the man that boy had become. Her own expression remained serene, but a storm of emotion was raging behind the calm facade. This was the moment she had rehearsed in her mind 1,000 times on the long journey west, the moment she had dreaded and longed for in equal measure. Seeing him standing there, so solid and real, was more overwhelming than she had ever anticipated. The whispers started, soft as the rustle of dry leaves. "Is that Duval's girl? I'll be," Martha Gable muttered to the woman next to her, who immediately turned to stare. No, couldn't be. What would she be doing back here? "Look at Harland. He looks like he's been struck by lightning." The murmur rippled outward from the platform. A stable hand who had come to meet the train saw the scene and quickly ambled back toward the main street, eager to be the first to spread the news. The prospectors, halfway to the saloon, paused when they saw the commotion, their interest in whiskey momentarily replaced by their interest in the unfolding human drama. Harmony Creek was a small town, and a secret was a currency that devalued quickly. The return of Eleanor Duval, in the presence of Luke Harland, was not a secret. It was a thunderclap. Luke heard the whispers as if from a great distance. He felt the weight of the town's collective gaze settle upon him. He was suddenly acutely aware of his own appearance, his dusty boots, his worn denim trousers, the sweat stains on his chambray shirt. He was a rancher, dressed for work. She was a lady from another world. The chasm between them, which her father had so brutally enforced 7 years ago, seemed to have widened into an impassable canyon. What was he supposed to do? Tip his hat and say, "Welcome home, Miss Duval." The words felt absurd, insulting. The history between them was too raw, too deep for such meaningless pleasantries. Finally, Eleanor broke the silent standoff, with a grace that seemed entirely out of place in the dusty, sun-baked setting. She took a steadying breath and turned away from him. She picked up her valise and began to walk toward the end of the platform that led to the main street. She did not look back. Her steps were measured and unhurried, her back straight, her head held high. She walked through the sea of curious and shocked faces as if she were strolling through a garden. She was a ship sailing through parted waters, leaving a wake of stunned silence and frantic whispers behind her. Her movement broke Luke's paralysis. It was like being doused with a bucket of cold water. She was leaving, again. The thought, irrational and primal, spurred him into action. He took a clumsy step forward, then another. His body wanted to follow her, to close the distance, to demand answers to the 1,000 questions that were now screaming in his head. Asterisk, why? Why now, after all this time, asterisk? But his pride, a stubborn and deeply ingrained part of his character, held him back. He would not make a spectacle of himself. He would not run after her in front of the entire town, giving them more to talk about for the next decade. He had his dignity. It was one of the few things he had managed to build for himself in the years she'd been gone, and he would not let it be torn down in a single, desperate moment. So he stopped, rooted again to the spot, and simply watched her go. He watched as she reached the end of the platform and stepped down onto the dusty street. He watched as she paused for a moment, her gaze sweeping over the familiar, shabby storefronts, the saloon, the assayer's office, the imposing facade of Duval's Emporium, which still bore her father's name, though the old man had been in his grave for a year now. He watched her walk past it all, her blue dress a slash of impossible color against the drab browns and grays of the town. The freight men, who had been waiting with professional patience, finally called out to him, "Harland, you here for the salt?" The word salt sounded foreign, like it belonged to another language, another lifetime. He turned his head slowly, his movement stiff and mechanical. He looked at the open door of the freight car, at the burlap sacks stacked inside. It was the reason he was here. A simple, practical chore. An anchor to the life he had known just 10 minutes ago. "Yeah," he managed to say, his voice a hoarse croak. He cleared his throat. "Yeah, that's me." He forced his legs to move, walking toward the freight car on unsteady feet. He worked with a grim, focused intensity, heaving the heavy sacks onto his shoulder and carrying them, one by one, to his wagon. The physical exertion was a welcome distraction, a way to silence the riot in his mind. But with every step, he was aware of her. He could feel her presence in the town like a change in the weather. The air itself felt different, charged with a new and dangerous electricity. By the time he had loaded the last sack, she was gone from sight. But the whispers remained. He could hear them from the group of women still clustered near the station, from the men drifting out of the saloon to see what the fuss was about. The news was spreading like a prairie fire. Eleanor Duval was back. Luke climbed onto the seat of his wagon, his muscles aching with a weariness that went far beyond the physical labor. He gathered the leather reins in his hands, the familiar feel of them offering little comfort. He stared down the main street, the street she had just walked down. His simple errand was complete. He could go home now, back to the solitude and predictable peace of Timber Ridge. But he knew, with a certainty that settled in his gut like a cold stone, that there was no going back. Not really. The ghost had returned, no longer a faint memory but a woman of flesh and blood, walking the streets of his town, and the carefully ordered world of Luke Harland had just been thrown into chaos. He clicked the reins, and the wagon lurched forward. But he wasn't heading away from the chaos. He was driving right into the heart of it. The road to Timber Ridge was a lonely ribbon of dirt, unwinding through a landscape of rolling hills and vast, open sky. Luke had driven it thousands of times, in every season and every kind of weather. He knew each twist and turn, each rocky outcrop, each distant butte that marked the miles. It was a journey he usually made with his mind quiet, his thoughts occupied by cattle prices, fence lines that needed mending, or the likelihood of rain. But today, the familiar scenery was just a blur. His world had shrunk to the confines of his own skull, where a single image played over and over again Eleanor, standing on the station platform, a ghost made real. The wagon wheels groaned under the weight of the salt, a rhythmic complaint that did nothing to soothe the frantic turmoil in his mind. The sacks of salt, he looked at them dumbly. An hour ago, they had been the entire purpose of his day. Now they felt like relics from another man's life, a life of simple, predictable chores that had been irrevocably shattered. Every clink of the harness, every plodding step of the horses, seemed to beat out her name, Eleanor. Eleanor. By the time he turned onto the lane that led to his ranch, the sun was slanting low in the west, painting the undersides of the few scattered clouds in fiery shades of orange and rose. The ranch house, nestled in a protective crook of the hills, came into view. It was a sturdy, unpretentious structure, built by his own hands from timber he'd felled himself. It was a house born of sweat and stubbornness, a testament to 7 years of relentless work. He had built it to be a fortress against the world, against the memory of loss. He realized now it had no defenses against this. Diego was waiting on the porch, leaning against a post, rolling a cigarette with his nimble, brown fingers. He was a small, wiry man with a face as weathered as a desert rock and eyes that saw more than most. He had been with Luke for 6 of the 7 years, and he was more than a foreman. He was the closest thing to family Luke had. Diego straightened up as the wagon approached, his dark eyes taking in the rigid set of Luke's shoulders, the grim line of his mouth. "You got the salt," Diego observed, his voice calm. It was not a question. "Yeah," Luke grunted, pulling the horses to a halt near the barn. He swung down from the wagon seat, his body feeling stiff and unnaturally heavy. Diego took a slow drag from his cigarette, the tip glowing red in the fading light. "Something else, too, I think." Luke didn't answer. He began untying the ropes that held the sacks in place, his movements jerky and overly forceful. He didn't want to talk. To give voice to what had happened would be to admit it was real, and he wasn't ready for that. He heaved a sack onto his shoulder, the rough burlap scratching his neck, and carried it into the cool, shadowed interior of the barn. He worked in silence, making trip after trip, his muscles straining, welcoming the burn of the labor. Diego watched him, his expression unreadable, and then, without a word, began to unhitch the horses from the wagon. They worked in the companionable silence they had perfected over the years. But tonight it was different. It was a silence filled with unspoken questions, thick with the weight of the past. When the last sack was stored and the horses were tended to, Luke stood in the barn doorway, staring at the house. The windows were dark. It wasn't a home. It was just a place he slept. He'd never realized it so starkly before. "She is back," Diego said quietly from behind him. It wasn't a question either. "The news came from town with young Jimmy from the Miller place. It travels fast." Luke's shoulders sagged. He leaned his forehead against the rough wood of the doorframe, the scent of hay and old leather filling his nostrils. He didn't have to ask who she was. There was only one. "Yeah," he breathed out. "She's back." He didn't wait for a reply. He walked to the house, his spurs ringing softly on the hard-packed earth. Inside, the main room was neat and spare. A simple table and 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, a bookshelf holding a half-dozen worn volumes, and a comfortable-looking armchair near the hearth. He walked to the wash basin, poured water from the pitcher, and splashed it on his face. The cold shock did nothing to clear his head. He saw her face in the rippling water. He sank into the armchair, the worn leather groaning under his weight. He didn't light a lamp. He sat in the gathering darkness as the last light bled from the sky, and he let the memories he had fought so hard to keep buried rise to the surface. He was 22 again, lying on his back in a hidden grove of aspen trees down by Harmony Creek. It was a cathedral of green and gold, the slender white trunks rising like pillars, the leaves shimmering and whispering with every breath of wind. The air smelled of damp earth and wild mint, and next to him, propped on one elbow, was Eleanor. She was reading to him, her voice a low murmur that was part of the music of the grove. "I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach," she read, her finger tracing the words on the page. He had no idea what it meant, not really, but he understood the look in her eyes as she lifted them from the book and met his. He understood the way her smile made his chest feel too small for his heart. She was from a different world, a world of books and learning and soft hands that had never known a day of hard labor. He was just a boy trying to tame a piece of land, his hands rough and calloused, his education limited to what was necessary to read a brand and tally a herd. But in that grove, none of it mattered. She never made him feel small. She made him feel like the words she read were about them. "My father would be furious if he knew I was here," she had whispered, closing the book and lying back in the grass beside him. "Let him be," Luke had whispered back, his voice full of a young man's reckless confidence. He turned his head, his face so close to hers he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes. "We won't be here for him to be angry at for much longer." The plan had been as desperate as it was simple. He had a little money saved, enough for 2 train tickets west and a fresh start. They would leave in the middle of the night. She would pack a small bag. He would have his horse ready. They would ride to the next town, sell the horse, and board a train bound for Oregon. They talked about it for hours, their voices hushed with the thrill of their secret. They would build their own house, have children, and live a life where her father's money and disapproval couldn't reach them. It had felt so real, so possible, in the dappled sunlight of the aspen grove. The memory soured, the golden light turning dark and cold. The night they had chosen. He had been waiting, hidden in the shadows of the livery stable, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. He was supposed to meet her behind her family's home at midnight, but midnight came and went. A knot of ice formed in his stomach. Something was wrong. He didn't have to wait long to find out what it was. 2 figures emerged from the darkness of the alley. He didn't recognize them at first, but then he saw the looming shape of Marcus Duval behind them. Eleanor's father. "Looking for someone, boy?" Duval's voice was as cold and hard as river stone. Before Luke could answer, the 2 hired men were on him. It wasn't a fight. It was a brutal, one-sided lesson in social standing. He remembered the sickening impact of a fist against his jaw, the bright flash of pain. He remembered being dragged into the stables, the smell of manure and fear. He remembered the dull, heavy thuds of boots against his ribs. His side. He didn't cry out. He refused to give Duval the satisfaction. He just curled into himself, tasting blood and dirt, while Eleanor's father stood over him, his face illuminated by the pale moonlight spilling through the stable door. "You will never see my daughter again," Duval had said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "You are nothing, a piece of dirt she scraped onto her shoe. I'm sending her where you can never reach her, where she will forget a low life like you ever existed. If you ever try to contact her, if I so much as hear your name cross her lips again, I will make sure you disappear from this valley for good." They left him there on the filthy straw. It took him an hour to get to his feet, every breath a fresh agony. He had stumbled back to his small, empty cabin, his dream of Oregon turning to ash in his mouth. He had been a fool to think it could have been any other way. He sat up in his chair, the memory so vivid he could almost feel the phantom ache in his ribs. He ran a hand over his face, the rasp of his stubble out in the quiet room. The worst part hadn't been the physical pain. It had been the utter, soul-crushing helplessness. Duval had been right. He was nothing, and he had nothing to offer her but a life of hardship that would have paled in comparison to the comfort she was used to. Perhaps her father had done them both a favor. It was a lie he had tried to tell himself for 7 years. He got up and walked to the small chest of drawers in the corner of the room. He opened the top drawer and took out an old tobacco tin. Inside, nestled on the bottom, was a small, folded piece of paper, its creases worn soft with time. He carried it back to his chair, though he didn't need a lamp to read it. He knew the words by heart. Diego had brought it to him a month after she was gone, a young maid. Sarah had risked her job to slip it to him at the market. Luke had unfolded it with trembling, bruised fingers. The handwriting was a simple, unpracticed scrawl, the words smudged with what might have been tears. Asterisk, she made me promise to tell you. They watch her every move. She is not allowed to write. She said to tell you. I am not allowed to love you, but I have not stopped. He had read it 100 times that first night and 1,000 times since. For 7 years, those words had been his secret sustenance. They were proof that he hadn't imagined it all, that the love he felt hadn't been a one-sided delusion. She had loved him, too, but the words were a comfort and a curse. They had kept the wound from healing, had kept the hope he'd tried so hard to kill from ever truly dying. Now, sitting in the darkness of the house he had built on the ashes of their dream, he folded the paper and put it back in the tin. He had been a boy when he'd first read that note. Now he was a man with a ranch and a measure of respect, but he felt as helpless now as he had on the floor of that stable. She was back, and he had no idea what it meant. Was she here to see him, or was her return a coincidence? A visit to her father's grave, a brief stop before she returned to the new life she had surely built in the East. That thought was a fresh kind of pain, the idea that she might have come back and not for him. The moon had risen, casting pale squares of light on the wooden floor. The silence of the house pressed in on him. He had grown used to the silence, had even come to find a kind of peace in it. But tonight, it was an accusing, empty thing. It was the sound of a life lived alone, the sound of what he had lost. And for the first time in 7 years, he was terrified of what the morning would bring. Sleep, when it finally came to Luke in the long hours before dawn, was a shallow and troubled thing. He woke with the first gray light, feeling as though he hadn't rested at all. The ghosts of the previous day had haunted his dreams, and now, in the quiet of the morning, they lingered. He rose, went through the familiar motions of his morning routine, stoking the fire, making coffee, checking the stock, but a new and profound sense of unreality colored everything. The solid, predictable world of Timber Ridge felt fragile, as if it might dissolve into mist at any moment. He knew he couldn't stay hidden on the ranch forever. Life had demands that paid no mind to a man's emotional turmoil. He was low on coffee and flour, and a piece of harness leather had split yesterday. Needing a new rivet he didn't have. A trip to town was unavoidable. The thought of it settled like a lead weight in his gut. He would have to face the whispers, the curious stares. He would have to walk the same dusty street she now walked. For a moment, he considered sending Diego, but he dismissed the thought immediately. He was not a man who hid from his problems. He would face this, whatever it was, head on. He saddled his horse, a steady buckskin named Clay, and rode out under a sky that was turning from pale gray to a brilliant, unforgiving blue. The 10-mile ride felt different today. He saw the landscape with an unnerving clarity, every detail sharpened by the tension coiling inside him. He saw the way the sunlight caught the dew on the sagebrush, the lazy circle of a hawk high overhead, the distant line of aspen trees marking the path of Harmony Creek. He couldn't help but wonder if she was looking at that same sky, that same line of trees. As he rode into Harmony Creek, he felt the change instantly. The town, usually sleepy and indifferent in the mid-morning, seemed alert, watchful. He kept his eyes fixed between his horse's ears, but he could feel the gazes from the doorways and windows he passed. He saw Mrs. Gable sweeping her porch with a vigor that was solely for show, her eyes tracking his progress. He saw a group of men outside the saloon pause their conversation to watch him ride by. The news had indeed traveled fast. He was no longer just Luke Harland, rancher. He was once again one half of a story, a piece of town lore brought back to life. He dismounted in front of Abernathy's general store, the bell above the door announcing his arrival with a cheerful, dissonant jingle. The place smelled, as it always did, of roasted coffee beans, cured leather, dried apples, and lye soap. It was the scent of civilization in the wilderness, a scent that had always been comforting in its familiarity. Today, it did nothing to calm the pounding of his heart. Mr. Abernathy, a thin, balding man with kind eyes and an insatiably curious nature, was behind the counter, polishing a pair of spectacles. "Morning, Luke," he said, his voice a little too bright. "Come for those supplies." "Morning, Silas," Luke replied, his own voice sounding rougher than usual. He handed the list Diego had written for him across the counter. "And a strip of leather, half-inch wide. Need to fix a trace." "Right away," Abernathy said, bustling off to gather the items. The store was empty, save for the two of them. Luke was grateful for the small mercy. He leaned against the counter, tracing a pattern in the countertop dust with his finger, trying to force his mind to be still. He would get his things and leave. It would be simple. He would not see her. It was a large enough town that they could surely avoid one another. It was a foolish, desperate hope, and he knew it. The bell above the door jingled again. Luke didn't turn around, but every muscle in his body went rigid. He heard the soft rustle of a skirt, the light, confident footfalls on the wooden floor, a sound completely different from the heavy tread of a rancher's wife or the scuff of a cowboy's boots. A faint scent, something clean and floral like lavender, drifted through the air, cutting through the store's earthier smells. He knew, with a certainty that made his stomach clench, who had just walked in. He heard Mr. Abernathy's intake of breath. "Good morning, ma'am," the storekeeper said. His voice strained with a mixture of surprise and professional courtesy. "What can I do for you?" "Good morning, Mr. Abernathy," a voice replied. It was her voice, deeper than he remembered, smoother, with a carefully modulated cadence that spoke of Eastern refinement. But it was hers. The sound of it struck him like a physical blow, vibrating through his bones, waking every memory he had tried to put to sleep. He squeezed his eyes shut for a brief second, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of the counter. Asterisk, just get the supplies and go. Do not turn around. "I was hoping to purchase some basic provisions," she said. "Flour, coffee, sugar, some kerosene for a lamp." Of course, Miss Duval." Abernathy stammered, his curiosity overriding his professionalism. It's a surprise to see you back in Harmony Creek." "Is it?" Eleanor's voice was cool, calm. "It feels as though I never left." The lie was so audacious, so bold, that Luke couldn't help himself. He turned. She was standing near the front of the store, examining a display of canned peaches. She was dressed more simply today, in a practical but well-cut dress of dark green cotton. Her hair was braided and pinned up, revealing the elegant column of her neck. She looked as though she belonged, as if she had been shopping in this very store just yesterday, and yet she was as out of place as a songbird in a chicken coop. She must have felt his eyes on her, because she turned her head, and their gazes met across the length of the store. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with 7 years of silence. The curious, rustling presence of Mr. Abernathy faded into the background. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. He saw a woman who was a stranger, her face composed, her expression unreadable. But in her eyes, he saw the girl he knew, and he saw a flicker of the same trapped panic he felt. She broke the silence first. She gave him a small, polite smile that did not reach her eyes. "Mr. Harland," she said, her voice even. The formality of it was a slap. Asterisk Mr. Harland. He was the man who had held her, who had whispered his dreams to her in the darkness, who had planned to spend his life with her. He was now Mr. Harland. He felt a flash of anger, hot and sharp, followed by a wave of crushing sorrow. He had to respond. To remain silent would be to admit defeat. He straightened up, pulling the tattered remnants of his pride around him like a cloak. He gave a stiff, formal nod. "Miss Duval," he said, and the name felt like a betrayal on his tongue. "I trust you are well," she continued, her tone that of a casual acquaintance making polite conversation. "I am," he said, his voice flat. "And you?" "Very well, thank you." The exchange was absurd, a farce. They stood there, 2 feet from the bolt of calico she had once picked out for a dress she'd planned to wear on their journey west. And they spoke like strangers meeting for the first time. But beneath the placid surface of their words, a war was being waged in the space between them. His eyes asked the questions his mouth could not form. Asterisk. "Why are you here? Why did you never write? Did you forget me?" Asterisk. Her eyes seemed to hold a universe of answers she could not speak, a silent plea for an understanding he could not give. Mr. Abernathy, sensing the monumental tension, busied himself behind the counter, making far more noise than was necessary to sack a bag of flour. "It is a much warmer welcome than the one I received 7 years ago," she said, her voice dropping almost to a whisper, so low that only he could hear. The statement was a sudden, shocking crack in her composed facade. Luke's jaw tightened. "Some things change." "And some things don't," she countered, her gaze unwavering. He didn't know how to answer that. What did she mean? Was she talking about the town or about them? The ambiguity was torturous. She seemed to sense she had pushed him as far as he would go. She took a small breath, and her polite mask slipped back into place. "Mr. Abernathy, I'll take 2 pounds of the Arbuckle coffee. Please." She turned her attention back to the storekeeper, effectively dismissing Luke. He felt a fool, standing there. He turned back to the counter as Abernathy finished packing his order. He paid for his goods, his movements wooden. He had to leave. He had to get out of this suffocating room, away from her presence. "Luke," she said, her voice soft again. He froze, his hand on the canvas sack. She had used his name. He turned back to her slowly. "I imagine you're wondering where I'm staying," she said. It wasn't a question. He said nothing, only watched her, waiting. She looked at him, and, for the first time, he saw a glimmer of true vulnerability in her eyes. "I've taken a lease on the old Miller cottage," she said, her words clear and deliberate. "The one down by the creek." The air left his lungs in a silent rush. The Miller cottage, a small, derelict cabin that had been empty for years. A cabin that sat not 100 yards from their aspen grove. The cabin they had walked past 100 times, dreaming, asterisk. "We could fix this place up," she had said once, her head on his shoulder. Asterisk. "We could put a porch on the front and plant roses by the door. We could live here, just us." It had been their place, a symbol of the simple, beautiful life they had planned to build together. And she was living there now, alone. The implications of her statement crashed over him in a devastating wave. This was no coincidence. Her return was not random. Choosing that specific place was a message, but he couldn't decipher it. Was it a declaration of war, a way to taunt him with the ghost of what they'd lost? Or was it an invitation, a sign that she had come back to reclaim their dream? He looked at her, searching her face for a clue, for any hint of her true intentions. But her expression was once again carefully neutral. He finally found his voice, though it was a hoarse whisper. "Why?" It was the only word that mattered. A sad, knowing smile touched her lips. "Perhaps I was simply looking for a quiet place to stay. Mr. Harland," she said, her voice reverting to its formal tone. "Good day to you." She turned back to the counter to pay for her own things, leaving him standing in the middle of the store with a sack of flour in his hands and his world completely upended. He stood there for a long moment, unable to move, feeling the burn of her revelation. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out, the jingle of the bells sounding like a death knell behind him. He secured his supplies to his saddle and mounted his horse in a daze. The ride back to Timber Ridge was a torment. The image of her face, the sound of her voice, the polite, cruel dance of their conversation, and above all, the knowledge that she was there. In their cottage, by their creek. The fortress he had built for himself had not just been breached, it had been occupied by the enemy, or perhaps by the only ally he had ever truly wanted. He didn't know which thought was more terrifying. The following 2 days were a quiet, personal hell for Luke. He worked from before sunrise until well after sunset, throwing himself into the most physically demanding tasks the ranch had to offer. He repaired a long stretch of fence on the rocky north pasture, cleared a stubborn patch of mesquite, and reshoed 2 of the horses himself, working until his muscles screamed in protest and his hands were raw. He was trying to build a wall of exhaustion around his thoughts, to create a fatigue so profound that it would leave no room for the woman in the cottage by the creek. It was a failed strategy. Her image was relentless. He saw her in the heat shimmering off the plains. He heard her voice in the whisper of the wind through the pines. Every crack of a hammer, every thud of a post driver, echoed the single tormenting question her presence had raised. Why ? On the evening of the 3rd day, as he was washing the grime from his hands and face at the pump, he saw a boy from town riding up the lane. It was young Thomas Miller, a freckle-faced kid of about 12, who sometimes ran errands for a few bits. The boy rode with an air of great importance, holding a small, folded piece of paper in his hand. Luke's heart began a slow, heavy thud against his ribs. He knew, before the boy even spoke, who the note was from. "Mr. Harlan," Thomas said, pulling his pony to a halt. "This is for you." Luke dried his hands on his trousers and took the offered paper. It was a clean, cream-colored sheet, folded neatly. Her name was not on the outside. His was Luke Harland. Seeing his name in her elegant, deliberate script sent a tremor through his hand. "Who gave this to you, son?" he asked, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "The lady staying at my granddad's old cottage," the boy said, his eyes wide with the significance of his own news. "The fancy one from back east, Miss Duval." "Did she give you a message?" "Just this and this," Thomas said, holding out a shiny new nickel. "For my trouble." Luke reached into his pocket and pulled out a dime. "This is for yours," he said, pressing it into the boy's palm. "Thank you, Thomas." The boy's face lit up. He gave a quick nod, wheeled his pony around, and galloped back toward town, no doubt bursting with the tale of his important delivery. Luke watched him go until he was just a small dust cloud in the distance. Then, his gaze fell to the note in his hand. He carried it to the porch and sat on the top step, the wood still warm from the afternoon sun. For a long moment, he just held it, staring at his own name. It felt heavier than a stone, filled with the weight of 7 years of unanswered questions. With a deep breath, he broke the seal. The message inside was brief, the words as elegant and controlled as her handwriting. Asterisk, Mr. Harland. Asterisk, I believe we have things that must be said, things that cannot be spoken in the middle of a general store. If you are willing, I would ask you to call on me at the cottage this evening, after sundown. It is time we spoke plainly. Asterisk, sincerely. Asterisk, asterisk, Eleanor Duval, asterisk. He read it 3 times. Asterisk, it is time we spoke plainly. The words were a challenge and an invitation, a promise and a threat. His first instinct, the one born of 7 years of self-preservation, was to burn the note and ignore it. He had built a life here, a quiet, orderly life. He had survived her absence. Could he survive her return, inviting her back into his world? Even for a single conversation, felt like inviting a flame into a house made of dry timber. But a deeper, more honest part of him knew he had no choice. The uncertainty was a poison, seeping into every corner of his existence. He had to know why she was here. He had to hear, from her own lips, the story of the last 7 years. He owed it to the boy he had been, the boy who had loved her with a desperate, all-consuming fire. He had to know if any part of that boy, or that love, still remained. He folded the note, tucked it into his shirt pocket, and stood up. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the sky was a bruised purple, streaked with the last vestiges of orange light. He didn't bother to change his clothes or even run a comb through his hair. He walked to the corral, saddled Clay in the fading light, and rode out, not toward town, but toward the creek. The air grew cooler as he descended into the shallow valley carved by the water. The sound of the creek, a gentle, constant murmur, reached him first. It was a sound he knew intimately, a sound that was woven into the fabric of his best and worst memories. He passed the dark, silent shapes of the aspen grove, their leaves rustling like a crowd whispering secrets in the dusk. And then he saw it. Ahead, nestled in a small clearing, was the Miller cottage. For years it had been a ruin, its windows dark and empty, its porch sagging. But tonight, a warm, golden light shone from its single front window. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, a pale ribbon against the darkening sky. It wasn't a ruin anymore. It was a home. The sight of that light, a beacon in the wilderness he had thought was his alone, made his breath catch in his throat. He dismounted and tied Clay's reins to a low-hanging branch, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked to the door, his boots making soft sounds in the dirt. He could smell wood smoke and something else, something warm and sweet like cinnamon. He raised his hand to knock, but hesitated. What was he about to walk into? What truths and what new pains awaited him on the other side of this door? He took a breath, firmed his resolve, and knocked twice. The door opened almost immediately. She stood there, silhouetted against the warm light from within. She was not wearing a fashionable city dress, but a simple, dark blue skirt and a white blouse. Her hair was unpinned, falling in a thick dark braid over one shoulder. Without the hat and the formal clothes, she looked younger. She looked more like the girl he remembered. "Luke," she said, her voice soft. The formal Mr. Harland was gone. "Eleanor," he replied, and the name, spoken aloud to her for the first time in 7 years, felt both strange and perfectly natural on his tongue. "Thank you for coming," she said, stepping back. "Please, come in." He stepped across the threshold and into the small cottage. The single room was transformed. It was spotlessly clean, the floorboards swept, the stone hearth free of ash. A fire crackled cheerfully, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. A small table was set with 2 cups and a steaming teapot. A few books were stacked neatly on a crate that served as a side table. It was sparse, but it was filled with a warmth and a sense of life that his own house profoundly lacked. She had taken a wreck and, in a matter of days, had made it a place of comfort. He stood awkwardly in the middle of the room, holding his hat in his hands, feeling large and rough and out of place. He was acutely aware of the dust on his boots, the sweat still damp on his shirt. "Please, sit," she said, gesturing to one of the two simple wooden chairs by the fire. He did as he was told, perching on the edge of the seat. She poured tea into the cups, her movements graceful and sure. She handed one to him, her fingers brushing his for a fraction of a second. The brief contact was like a spark, a jolt of electricity that shot up his arm. She sat in the other chair, holding her own cup in both hands, her gaze fixed on the flames. The silence stretched between them, no longer the tense, public silence of the general store, but something deeper, more expectant. Finally, she spoke, her voice low. "I imagine you have questions." He gave a short, humorless laugh. "You could say that." She turned her head to look at him, her expression serious, her eyes searching his. "The silence," she began. "The 7 years of silence. It wasn't my choice. Luke, you have to believe that." He looked down at his hands, at the calloused knuckles and scarred fingers. "It's hard to know what to believe." "I know," she whispered. "That's why I asked you to come. I need to tell you everything." She took a deep, steadying breath. "When my father sent me to Charleston, it was like being sent to prison, a very comfortable, very polite prison. I lived with his sister, my Aunt Caroline. She was a woman who understood her duty, and her duty, as my father made very clear, was to ensure that I forgot all about Harmony Creek, and especially about you." She described the life she had lived, a life of endless chaperoned social calls, of lessons in needlepoint and watercolor, of evenings spent in stifling parlors. She told him how her Aunt Caroline read every letter she wrote and every letter she received, the one and only time she had tried to write to him. The letter had been found and burned in front of her. She was told that if she ever attempted such a thing again, the consequences would be severe. Severe, how Luke asked, his voice a low growl. The old anger at Marcus Duval, an anger he thought had cooled to embers, was beginning to smolder again. "My father controlled everything," Eleanor explained, her voice tinged with a bitterness he had never heard from her before. "He controlled my aunt's finances. If she didn't follow his instructions to the letter, she would have been left with nothing. He threatened to cut me off entirely, to have me declared unfit and put somewhere less comfortable. They were just threats, perhaps, but at 18, they felt very real. I was trapped. Every word I said was monitored. Every step I took was watched." He listened, his rigid posture slowly softening as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The story he had told himself for 7 years that she had left, gone back to her world of comfort, and simply forgotten the poor cowboy she'd once dallied with was beginning to crumble. The anger he had harbored toward her was shifting, redirecting itself to the man who had orchestrated all this pain. "Why didn't you just run?" he asked, the question sounding naive even to his own ears. She gave him a sad smile. "Run where with what I had no money of my own. I knew no one. I was a prisoner. Luke, as surely as if I'd been behind iron bars. The only connection I had to you was that one note Sarah helped me send. I prayed every night that it reached you. Did it?" "It reached me," he said softly. He thought of the worn, folded paper in his tobacco tin. It had been the only thing that had kept him sane some nights. "I held on to the memory of our aspen grove," she continued, her eyes growing distant. "Some days, it was the only thing that felt real. I would close my eyes and I could hear the leaves, feel the sun on my face. I would remember the poems we read, the plans we made. It was a world inside my head where they couldn't follow me." She fell silent for a moment, lost in the memory. Luke watched her, seeing not the elegant woman from the city, but the trapped girl she had been. He saw the strength it must have taken to endure, to hold on to that inner world for so long. "My father passed away a year ago," she said, her voice quiet again. "I read about it in a Charleston newspaper. My aunt told me it was my duty to mourn him, and I did, in my own way. He was my father, but his death, it was also my release." She explained that her father, in a final act of control, had left her his entire fortune, but with a stipulation she could not inherit it until she was 25 years old, or until she married a man approved by a board of his business associates. "I turned 25 2 months ago," she said, "the day I came into my inheritance. The lawyers handed me control of everything. I was finally free. My aunt, my father's associates. They had no more power over me. They all expected me to stay, to marry some banker or shipping magnate. They presented me with suitable candidates." She paused, setting her teacup down with a hand that was not quite steady. She looked at him directly, and in her eyes, he saw the full, undiluted truth of 7 years of sorrow and hope. "I had choices. Luke, for the first time in my life, I had real choices. I could have bought a grand house in Charleston. I could have traveled to Europe. I could have done anything I wanted." Her voice began to shake, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. "But there was only one choice that mattered. There was only one place I needed to be." She took a ragged breath. "And so I chose to come back here." Her final words hung in the small, fire-lit room, as potent and real as the scent of wood smoke. Asterisk, I chose to come back here. Asterisk. It was a confession, a verdict, and an accusation all at once. An accusation against the years that had been stolen from them, against the man who had stolen them, and against the silence that had festered between them like a wound. Luke felt as though the floor had dropped out from under him. For 7 years, he had built his life on a foundation of her abandonment. It was a bitter, ugly foundation, but it was solid. He had told himself she had chosen comfort over love, family over him. He had convinced himself that the girl in the aspen grove had been a fleeting dream, and the woman who left on the train was the reality. That story, painful as it was, had an ending. It had allowed him to harden his heart, to pour his energy into his land, to become the solitary, self-sufficient man he was today. Now, with a few quiet sentences, she had taken a hammer to that foundation, and it was crumbling into dust around him. She hadn't chosen to leave. She had been taken. She hadn't forgotten him. She had been imprisoned. The relief that should have washed over him was complicated, tangled up with a fresh and agonizing wave of pain. It was the pain of a profound injustice, the pain of knowing that their shared suffering had been entirely, cruelly unnecessary. He stared at her, at the single tear tracking a path of moonlight on her cheek, and the careful walls around his heart began to crack. He saw past the elegant woman who had stepped off the train, past the composed stranger in the general store. He saw the 18-year-old girl, trapped and terrified, clinging to a memory as her only source of light. "They told you I was a mistake," he finally said, his voice a low rasp. "A bad choice. Did you ever believe them?" Eleanor shook her head. A small, decisive movement. She finally raised a hand to brush away the tear, her gesture resolute. "Never. Not for a single day. In fact, the more they tried to convince me, the more certain I became that you were the only right choice I had ever made." She looked away from him, toward the fire, as if the memories were easier to face in the flickering flames. "My aunt, she did her duty. She introduced me to a parade of suitable young men, sons of bankers, shipping heirs from Savannah, plantation owners with pedigrees as long as the Mississippi River. They were all handsome enough, I suppose. They were polite. They were educated. They knew which fork to use and could speak about politics and finance." She paused, a wry, sad smile touching her lips. "They were all incredibly, profoundly boring. When they looked at me, they saw an heiress. They saw a pretty wife to adorn their homes. They saw a connection to my father's name and fortune. Not a single one of them saw *me*. She turned her gaze back to him, and the full force of her conviction struck him like a physical blow. Her eyes were clear, honest, and filled with a deep, unwavering certainty. I would sit in those stifling parlors, listening to them talk, and all I could think about was you. I'd think about you sitting in the grass, listening to me read poetry you pretended not to understand. I'd think about the way you laughed, a real laugh that came from deep in your chest. I'd think about the look in your eyes when you told me about your plans for this land, the way your face lit up with a passion none of those wealthy men could ever hope to possess. She leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped in her lap. The firelight caught the earnest, pleading light in her eyes. They could offer me the world. Luke, houses, jewels, trips to Paris. But none of them could offer me a quiet afternoon in an aspen grove. None of them could make my heart feel like it was too big for my body. None of them, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, thick with the weight of 7 years of lonely conviction. None of them were you. The words, so simple and so direct, landed in the center of his soul. It was the answer to the question that had haunted him for a quarter of his life. He had been loved. He had been remembered. He had not been betrayed. The relief was so immense, so overwhelming, that it felt like pain. It was the agony of a limb, long numb. Finally, having the blood rush back into it, a pins and needles torment that was the first sign of healing. But with that relief came the ghosts of the life that should have been. He saw a phantom version of the past 7 years, a shared home. Children with her eyes and his stubborn chin. The hardships and triumphs of building a life together, side by side, all of it stolen. A bitter, useless anger rose in him, not at her, but at the cruelty of fate and the cold, hard will of her father. 7 years, he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He took 7 years from us. Eleanor. Yes, she whispered, her own eyes filling with tears again. He did, and we can never get them back. All we have is now. Now. The word hung between them. What did it mean? What were they now? They were not the young, reckless lovers of the past. They were two strangers, shaped and scarred by 7 years of separate lives. He was a man who had learned to live with silence. She was a woman of wealth and experience, a world away from the girl who had loved him. The chasm between them was still there, a canyon carved by time and sorrow. He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the strength in her face, the resilience that had allowed her to endure her gilded cage and emerge with her spirit intact. He saw the courage it had taken for her to turn her back on a life of ease and return to this dusty, forgotten corner of the world. She had come back for him. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. It placed a responsibility on him he hadn't felt in a long time, a responsibility to more than just his land and his cattle. The bitter poison of resentment, the poison he had been slowly drinking for 7 years, began to drain out of him. In its place was a vast, aching emptiness, but it was a clean emptiness. It was a space that could, perhaps, be filled again. He knew he couldn't simply pick up where they had left off. The boy who had made those promises in the aspen grove was gone, replaced by a man who was more cautious, more guarded. The trust that had once been as easy as breathing between them was now a fragile, tentative thing. I spent 7 years learning how to be alone, he said, his voice raw with an honesty that cost him dearly. I built this life, this ranch, because it was the only thing I had left. It's quiet here. It's predictable. I don't know how to... He trailed off, unable to articulate the fear of letting her into that carefully constructed world, the fear of being hurt again. Eleanor listened, her expression full of a deep, patient understanding. She did not push, did not demand anything from him. She simply waited, giving him the space to find his words. When I saw you on that platform, he continued, looking at his own rough hands, I didn't know what to feel. Anger, shock, But mostly, I was scared. Scared of what it meant. Scared of all this. He gestured vaguely, indicating the cottage, the conversation, the overwhelming flood of the past. I am scared, too. Luke, she confessed softly. I don't know the man you've become, and you certainly don't know the woman I am now. I have come back to Harmony Creek, but I am not the same girl who left it. He looked up and met her eyes. The truth was there, stark and unavoidable. They were strangers, bound by a shared history that felt like a lifetime ago. He made a decision then, not with the reckless passion of his youth, but with the careful consideration of a man who understood the cost of a mistake. He could not offer her the blind, absolute love he had felt before. That had been burned out of him, but he could offer her something else, something slower, more deliberate, something that had a chance to grow in the barren soil of their shared loss. We can't go back. Eleanor, he said, his voice firm. We can't erase the years or pretend they didn't happen. The boy and girl we were, they're gone. A shadow of disappointment crossed her face, but she nodded in understanding. I know. But, he said, leaning forward, his forearms resting on his knees, maybe the people we are now, maybe they could get to know each other. He looked at her, holding her gaze, wanting to be sure she understood. No promises, no talk of the past, just starting over. He paused, searching for the right word. As friends. The word friends felt both inadequate and essential. It was a safe harbor in a storm of emotion. It was a foundation, solid and honest, upon which something new might be built. It was a promise of caution, but it was not a rejection. Eleanor considered his words for a long moment. He watched her, his heart in his throat, waiting for her answer. He saw the flicker of hope in her eyes, warring with the potential for disappointment. He saw her weigh the proposition, and then a slow, genuine smile spread across her face. It was the first real smile he had seen from her, and it was like the sun breaking through clouds. Friendship, she said, her voice warm and clear. Friendship is a fine place to start. A good, strong foundation. She extended her hand across the small space between them. It was a formal, almost businesslike gesture, but her eyes held a different message, one of warmth and infinite patience. He looked at her offered hand. It was pale and slender, the hand of a lady, but there was strength in it too. He reached out and took it. His own hand was rough, calloused, and covered in the dust of his labor. The contrast was stark, a physical representation of the worlds that separated them. But her grip was firm, her touch warm. It was not the hand of a stranger. Friends. He agreed, the word feeling more hopeful, more full of possibility than he could have imagined. They sat like that for a moment, hand in hand, the fire crackling in the hearth, the ghosts of the past finally, blessedly. Silent. The pain was still there, a dull ache for the lost years. But for the first time since he had seen her step off that train, it was overshadowed by something else. It was the fragile, unfamiliar feeling of hope, taking root in the empty spaces of his heart. They would let time, the same force that had torn them apart, be the one to decide if it could bring them back together. The agreement made in the small, fire-lit cottage was a fragile truce, a suspension of the war that memory and heartache had waged within Luke for 7 years. The weeks that followed their conversation unfolded with a slow, cautious rhythm, like two wary combatants learning to lay down their arms. Autumn arrived in the high country, painting the aspen leaves in brilliant strokes of gold and orange, and bringing a crisp, clean edge to the air. With the changing of the seasons came a subtle but profound change in the life of Harmony Creek, a change centered around the two people the town could not stop watching. The first sign of this new reality was when Eleanor Duval became the town's new schoolmistress. The position had been unexpectedly vacated when old Mrs. Albright, who had taught 2 generations of Harmony Creek children their letters and sums, abruptly decided to move back east to live with her sister. The town council was in a bind. But Eleanor, with her Eastern education and refined speech, presented a solution that was both immediate and, for the gossips, endlessly fascinating. She approached the council with a quiet confidence, and after a brief, flustered meeting, she was hired. The old schoolhouse, a simple one-room building at the edge of town, was suddenly filled with a new kind of energy. Eleanor did not rule with the stern, switch-wielding authority of her predecessor. She ruled with stories, with patience, and with a genuine curiosity about the minds of her young charges. She taught geography by drawing maps of the world on the blackboard that went far beyond the borders of the territory. She taught literature by reading from books of poetry and adventure that held the children in rapt silence. She had a way of making every child, from the shyest rancher's daughter to the most boisterous trapper's son, feel as though they were clever and important. Harmony Creek observed this transformation from a respectable distance. Mothers, collecting their children at the end of the day, would linger, listening to the sound of laughter coming from the schoolhouse, a sound that had been notably absent during Mrs. Albright's tenure. They saw the neat stacks of firewood by the schoolhouse door, the clean-swept porch, the cheerful, if faded, curtains that had appeared in the windows. Miss Duval, the woman who had arrived as a mysterious and potentially scandalous figure, was quietly, efficiently, making herself a part of the community. But it was the second, and far more compelling, change to the town's rhythm that truly set tongues wagging. It started on a Monday afternoon in late September. Luke Harlan drove his wagon into town for his weekly supplies, a routine as predictable as the sunset. But after he had concluded his business at the general store and the blacksmith's, he did something he had never done before. He guided his horse not toward the road leading home to Timber Ridge, but toward the schoolhouse. He arrived just as Eleanor was dismissing the last of her students. He didn't go inside. He simply waited by his wagon, his hat in his hands, as the children streamed out, their voices bright in the cool afternoon air. The town, or at least the part of it that made it its business to know such things, watched from behind curtained windows and from the doorways of shops. They saw Eleanor emerge, a weary but pleased smile on her face. They saw her surprise at finding him there, a surprise that quickly melted into a quiet warmth. They couldn't hear the words that passed between them, but they could see the easy companionship in their posture. They watched as Luke took a heavy-looking tool from his wagon and, with a few deft movements, repaired the broken hinge on the schoolhouse gate that had been bothering everyone for a month. It was a simple, neighborly act, but between these two, nothing was simple. The following Monday, it happened again. This time, he arrived with a load of perfectly split pine wood in the back of his wagon, which he proceeded to stack neatly against the schoolhouse wall, enough to last her through the first cold snap. The Monday after that, he spent half an hour on the schoolhouse roof, securing a loose shingle that had been threatening to fly off in the next high wind. Every Monday, regular as clockwork, Luke Harlan would appear at the schoolhouse. Their meetings were always brief, always public, and always centered around some practical task. And every Monday, the town of Harmony Creek debated the meaning of it. "It's a courtship, plain and simple," Martha Gable declared one afternoon, holding court in Abernathy's general store. She thumped a bag of beans onto the counter for emphasis. A man doesn't fix a woman's roof every Monday out of simple friendship. "Now, Martha," Silas Abernathy cautioned, polishing the counter with a cloth, "Luke's a good man. The schoolhouse needed fixing. It's a service to the town, is all. A service to the town that happens to be personified by a very handsome schoolmistress," she retorted. "To the amusement of the two other women present, mark my words, he's staking a claim. Can you imagine what her father would say if he could see it? Marcus Duval would turn over in his grave." "Maybe that's the point," another woman chimed in softly. "Maybe after all this time, they're finally getting to live the life he denied them." This sentiment, romantic and satisfying, was the one that began to take hold. The town, which had initially been poised for scandal, found itself slowly being won over. They saw the quiet dignity in the way Luke and Eleanor conducted themselves. They saw the genuine good she was doing for their children. The whispers of gossip began to lose their sharp, judgmental edge, softening into a kind of communal, hopeful curiosity. The story of Luke and Eleanor was no longer a scandalous memory. It was a drama unfolding in their midst, and they were all watching, waiting for the next act. Luke, for his part, was largely oblivious to the nuances of the town's speculation. He knew they were talking, of course. He felt their eyes on him every time he hitched his horse outside the schoolhouse, but he didn't care. Those 30 minutes every Monday had become the focal point of his week, an anchor in the slow, rolling sea of his life. Their conversations were as simple and practical as the tasks he performed. They talked about the weather. He'd tell her a hard winter was coming, and she should make sure the schoolhouse was properly chinked. She'd tell him about her students, how young Sam Miller was a prodigy at arithmetic, how little Sarah Gable could draw horses with a startling realism. They were the conversations of friends, careful and polite, never straying into the treacherous territory of the past or the uncertain landscape of the future. And yet, in the spaces between the words, something else was growing. He found himself noticing the small things, the way a stray strand of her dark hair would catch the afternoon light, the dusting of chalk on her sleeve, the genuine, unfeigned delight in her eyes when she spoke about a student's breakthrough. He would leave these brief encounters and find the memory of her smile carrying him all the way back to the ranch, a small, warm coal glowing in his chest. One evening, after a particularly long day spent rounding up stray cattle from the high pastures, he and Diego were sitting on the porch, drinking coffee as the stars began to appear in the deep indigo sky. For a long while, neither of them spoke, the silence comfortable and familiar. "They say in town that a man can set his watch by your visits to the schoolhouse," Diego said finally, his voice a low rumble. He didn't look at Luke, but kept his eyes on the horizon. Luke stiffened, swirling the coffee in his mug. Let them talk. The gate was broken. The roof was leaking. All the things that need fixing in this valley, Diego mused, a hint of a smile in his voice. And they all seemed to be at the schoolhouse on a Monday afternoon. "What are you trying to say?" Diego Luke asked, his tone sharper than he intended. Diego finally turned to look at him, his dark eyes serious and knowing in the dim light. "I am saying that I see you. I see you leave on Monday morning, your shoulders tight. I see you come back, and they are not so tight. I hear you whistling sometimes, by the stables. You are not a whistling man." Luke fell silent. He hadn't realized he was whistling. He hadn't realized the change in him was so visible. He had been so focused on the cautious, careful steps of his renewed friendship with Eleanor that he hadn't stopped to notice the effect it was having on him. "We're just friends." "Diego," he said, the words sounding weak and defensive even to his own ears. "We agreed. It's safer that way." Diego took a slow sip of his coffee before answering. "Safe, perhaps, but I do not think safe is what your heart is looking for." He set his mug down on the porch railing and leaned forward, his expression earnest. "I have known you for 6 years. Asterisk, amigo, asterisk. I have seen you work until you nearly drop. I have seen you face down winter storms and cattle rustlers. I have seen you tired, angry, sad. I have seen you hollowed out by a memory, but I have not seen you smile. Not a real smile that reaches your eyes, until these past few weeks." He paused, letting his words sink in. Luke stared out into the vast, dark expanse of his land, the land that had been his only comfort for so long. Diego's voice softened, but his words lost none of their power. "That girl, that woman, she was the one who put the light in your eyes all those years ago, and she is the one who is putting it there now. I do not know what happened between you then, and I do not know what will happen now. That is your business, but I know what I see." He stood up, clapping a firm, gentle hand on Luke's shoulder. "No one else ever made you smile like that. Luke." He left Luke alone on the porch, the truth of his words echoing in the vast, starry silence. Luke sat there for a long time, the coffee growing cold in his mug. As the moon rose over the hills, he had been so afraid of what the town thought, so afraid of repeating the mistakes of the past, so focused on the precarious foundation of friendship he and Eleanor were trying to build. He had been so busy protecting his heart that he had failed to notice it was, slowly, tentatively, beginning to heal. For the first time, he allowed himself to acknowledge the simple, undeniable truth. Diego was right. He was happier. The quiet, aching loneliness that had been his constant companion for 7 years had begun to recede. It was being replaced by a quiet, aching hope, and it was all because of her. Friendship, he realized, might be a fine place to start, but he was beginning to suspect, with a feeling that was equal parts terror and joy, that it was not where their story was meant to end. Diego's words followed Luke for the rest of the week, echoing in the quiet moments between the clang of the forge and the lowing of the cattle. Asterisk. No one else ever made you smile like that. It was a simple observation, but it struck him with the force of a revelation, peeling back the layers of caution and fear he had so carefully constructed around his heart. He had been so focused on navigating the treacherous waters of their new friendship, so determined to avoid the mistakes of the past, that he had failed to acknowledge the simple, undeniable truth being with Eleanor felt like coming home. The hollow space inside him, the one that had been his constant companion for 7 long years, was beginning to fill with a light he had forgotten existed. Friendship was a fine place to build a foundation, but a man could not live in the foundation forever. He had to decide if he was brave enough to build the house. He made his decision on a Friday afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, spilling gold and honey across the valley. It wasn't a Monday. The thought was deliberate. This was not about a broken hinge or a leaking roof. This was not a neighborly visit. This was something else entirely. He found her not at the schoolhouse, but at her cottage. She was tending to a small, fledgling garden she had cultivated in the hard-packed earth near her porch. Her sleeves rolled up, a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She looked up as he approached, her hand shielding her eyes from the setting sun, and a slow, welcoming smile bloomed on her face. It was a smile that made the long ride from the ranch feel insignificant. "Luke," she said, her voice warm with surprise. "I wasn't expecting you. Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," he said, dismounting. He stood before her, his hat in his hands, feeling as nervous and uncertain as a boy of 17. "I came to ask you something." She straightened up, her expression turning from surprise to a gentle, watchful curiosity. "What is it?" "I want you to take a walk with me," he said, the words coming out more plainly than he'd intended. "There's a place I need to show you, a place I need to see again. With you." She didn't need to ask where. He saw the understanding dawn in her eyes, a flicker of memory, of shared history. He saw a brief shadow of the old pain, quickly followed by a glimmer of the same fragile hope that was currently warring with the fear in his own chest. She simply nodded, her gaze locked on his. "Let me just wash my hands," she said softly. She disappeared inside the cottage for a moment and emerged with her hair tidied and a light shawl draped over her shoulders. They didn't speak as they set off, walking side by side, but not touching. They left the small clearing of the cottage and found the familiar path that meandered alongside the creek. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and pine. The only sounds were the constant, soothing murmur of the water flowing over smooth stones and the soft crunch of their footsteps on the fallen leaves. The setting sun filtered through the canopy of cottonwoods and pines, creating long, dancing shadows that stretched across their path. It was a walk they had taken 100 times before, in another lifetime. Every bend in the creek, every familiar old tree, was a landmark in the lost country of their youth. Luke found himself stealing glances at her as they walked. He watched the way she moved, with a grace that seemed perfectly at home in this wild place. He watched the way her eyes took in every detail, as if she were trying to memorize it all, to reclaim it after her long exile. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was filled with everything they couldn't yet say, with the weight of the past and the terrifying, beautiful possibility of the future. After a quarter of a mile, the landscape opened up, and he saw it ahead. The aspen grove, their sanctuary. The slender, bone-white trunks rose up like the pillars of a forgotten cathedral, their leaves, now a brilliant, trembling gold, forming a luminous canopy against the deepening blue of the sky. The creek widened here, flowing slowly around a bend, its surface reflecting the fiery colors of the sunset. He stopped at the edge of the grove and turned to her. She had stopped beside him, her hands clasped in front of her, her gaze fixed on the familiar trees. Her face was a mask of warring emotions. He could see the joy of rediscovery, the sharp, piercing pain of memory, the overwhelming weight of all that had been lost and all that had, impossibly, been found again. "It's the same," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "It hasn't changed at all." "No," he said quietly. It waited. He led her into the heart of the grove, to the very spot where they had spent so many sun-drenched afternoons. It was a small, natural clearing, carpeted with soft grass, a large, flat-topped boulder, warmed by the last rays of the sun, sat near the water's edge. This was the place he had first found the courage to tell her he loved her, the place she had set it back, her voice as soft as the rustle of the leaves above them. She walked to the water's edge and stood with her back to him, her shoulders trembling. He saw her raise a hand to her face, and he knew she was crying. They were not the loud, desperate sobs of a broken heart, but the quiet, wrenching tears of a soul that was overflowing. Tears for the 7 stolen years, for the pain of her imprisonment, for the loneliness he had endured, tears for the impossible, miraculous fact that they were standing here, together, once again. He stood a few feet behind her, his own throat tight, his heart aching with a fierce, protective tenderness. The carefully constructed walls he had lived behind for so long were gone, washed away by the tide of her quiet grief. All that was left was the raw, undeniable truth of his feelings for her. He stepped forward, his boots making no sound on the soft earth. He reached out, not with the hesitant caution of a new friend, but with the certainty of a man who knows what he wants. He gently took her hand. It was cold, and he wrapped his own warm, calloused fingers around it, holding it tight. She didn't pull away. She leaned into his touch, her weeping softening into a series of ragged, quiet breaths. She turned her head, and he saw her face, wet with tears, her eyes shimmering with a depth of emotion that stole his breath. He saw the question in them, the same question that was echoing in his own soul. Asterisk. What now? What are we? Asterisk. He pulled her gently toward him until she was facing him. He raised his free hand and brushed a tear from her cheek with his thumb, his touch as reverent as a prayer. The feel of her skin, soft and warm, was an anchor in the swirling chaos of his emotions. He looked into her eyes, and he let her see everything he had kept hidden for so long. He let her see the loneliness, the anger, the years of quiet desperation, and he let her see the unwavering, indestructible core of love that had survived it all, buried but never extinguished. 7 years. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low and thick with an emotion he no longer tried to fight. 7 years of long days and longer nights. 7 years of telling myself I should forget you, that I should move on. He took another breath, his gaze never leaving hers. "But 7 years didn't change my heart. It never did." The words were a simple truth, spoken into the sacred quiet of their grove. They were the key that unlocked the final, most heavily guarded door inside him. He saw the recognition in her eyes, the dawning of a relief so profound it seemed to illuminate her from within. Her lips parted, as if to speak, but no words came out. There were no words left that needed to be said. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his head. He watched her eyes flutter closed. A silent surrender, an invitation. And then, his lips met hers. The first touch was gentle, hesitant, a question asked after a lifetime of silence. But then, all the pent-up longing, all the grief and the hope of 7 lost years surged between them. The kiss deepened, becoming something more than a kiss. It was a promise. It was a homecoming. It was the sealing of a vow made long ago and never broken. He tasted the salt of her tears, and it was the sweetest thing he had ever known. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close, and she melted against him, her arms twining around his neck. He could feel the frantic, beautiful beating of her heart against his own chest. The world fell away. There was no town, no ranch, no painful past. There was only the woman in his arms, the golden light of the setting sun filtering through the leaves, and the timeless, eternal murmur of the creek flowing beside them. It was a kiss that healed. It was a kiss that forgave. It was a kiss that began, in the heart of the place where their love had first been born, the rest of their lives. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless. He rested his forehead against hers, their eyes still closed, simply breathing each other in. The sun had finally set, and the grove was bathed in the soft, purple light of twilight. The first stars were beginning to appear in the sky above the canopy of leaves. She opened her eyes and looked up at him, her face serene, the tear tracks on her cheeks the only evidence of the storm that had just passed. A slow, radiant smile spread across her lips. "It never changed mine, either," she whispered. He held her there for a long time, in the deepening twilight, listening to the sound of the water and the whispering of the aspen leaves. The old promise had been broken, but here, in the heart of their sanctuary, a new one, stronger and more profound than they could have ever imagined, had just been made. The kiss in the aspen grove was not an ending, but a beginning. It was the turning of a page, the start of a new chapter written not in the frantic, secret whispers of youth, but in the steady, open prose of adulthood, the fragile truce of friendship, which had served as their bridge back to one another, blossomed into a quiet, confident courtship that unfolded in the golden light of the deepening autumn. Harmony Creek, which had been the stage for their initial, tense reunion, now became the backdrop for their gentle reconciliation. The town, which had watched them with the sharp, hungry eyes of gossip, now observed them with a softer, more proprietary gaze. The story of Luke and Eleanor was no longer a scandalous secret to be whispered behind cupped hands. It had become a public narrative, and the townspeople were its willing and increasingly supportive audience. Their courtship was a thing of simple, shared moments. On Saturday mornings, they would walk through the town's small market together. Luke, who had always strode through town with a solitary, purposeful air, now ambled at a slower pace, matching his long-legged stride to hers. He would carry her basket as she carefully selected vegetables from the miller's farm stand or a loaf of bread, still warm from the baker's oven. He would find himself in conversations he would have previously avoided, talking with the blacksmith about the price of iron while Eleanor discussed quilting patterns with the man's wife. He saw her charm and her genuine interest in people, and he watched as she effortlessly wove herself into the fabric of the community he had only ever existed on the fringes of. They would laugh, quiet, shared laughs over some small absurdity, and the sound would turn heads. But the stares they drew were no longer sharp with suspicion. They were soft with a kind of communal approval. Afternoons were often spent at her cottage. It became their shared project, under Luke's skilled hands. The sagging porch was made level and strong again. He replaced the 2 broken windows, and she sewed new curtains of cheerful yellow calico to hang in them. Together, they whitewashed the interior walls, the small room filling with the clean, sharp scent of lime and their easy, overlapping conversation. He would work, and she would bring him cool water from the creek, or sit on the porch steps reading to him as he planed a piece of wood. The words were different now, not the passionate sonnets of their youth, but stories from newspapers or passages from books about history or nature. The words were a comfortable backdrop to the quiet, steady work of rebuilding. They were, in the most literal sense, building a home together, and the significance of the act was lost on neither of them. "You know," Martha Gables said one afternoon to Silas Abernathy, as she watched Luke carefully planting a pair of rose bushes he'd dug up from his own ranch by Eleanor's front door. "I never thought I'd see the day. That boy has been a ghost for 7 years. It took her coming back to make him solid again." Silas, leaning on his store's broom, simply smiled. "Some folks are just meant to be. Takes them a while to find their way back, is all." The town's acceptance was a quiet, unspoken thing, but it was palpable. It was in the way the blacksmith offered Luke a discount on the new hinges for Eleanor's door. It was in the extra apple the baker's wife would slip into Eleanor's basket when she was with Luke. It was in the way people would nod and smile at them, a shared, knowing look that said, "It's about time." For Luke, this new life was a revelation. The solitude he had once mistaken for peace he now recognized as a profound loneliness. The silence of his own house, once a comfort, now felt empty when compared to the warmth and life of Eleanor's small cottage. He had spent 7 years believing that his heart was a barren piece of land, incapable of growth. But Eleanor's return had been like a spring rain. Things he thought were long dead were, miraculously, beginning to bloom. He loved watching her with the children. Sometimes, when he arrived at the schoolhouse a little early on a Monday, he would stand at a distance and just watch her through the open door. He'd see her kneeling beside a small child, patiently explaining a difficult sum, her face a perfect picture of gentle concentration. He'd hear her clear, musical voice leading the children in a song. He saw in her a capacity for nurturing, a deep well of kindness that he had only glimpsed when they were young. He saw the woman she had become, and he fell in love with her all over again. A love that was deeper, steadier, and more certain than the fiery passion of his youth. One evening in late October, when the air had a definite bite of winter to it and the last of the golden aspen leaves had fallen, she invited him to the cottage for dinner. It was the first time she had done so. It felt like a significant step, a move from the public sphere of their courtship into the private world of a shared life. He arrived to find the cottage transformed. The table was set with 2 plates, a small bouquet of late-blooming wildflowers in a jar at its center. A stew simmered on the hearth, filling the small room with a rich, savory aroma. It was a simple meal, a simple setting, but to Luke, who had eaten his own cooking alone for more years than he could count, it felt like a banquet. They ate in a comfortable silence, the crackling of the fire and the clink of their spoons against the bowls the only sounds. After, they sat in the 2 chairs before the fire, drinking coffee. The ease between them was a marvel. There were no more silences to be filled with difficult questions, no more ghosts to be placated. There was only a deep and abiding peace. He watched her as she stared into the flames, the firelight catching the gold in her brown eyes and turning her dark hair to a rich mahogany. He knew, with a certainty that was as calm and deep as the night sky outside, that he could not spend another day of his life without her. The fear was gone, replaced by a resolve as solid as the mountains that ringed the valley. He had waited long enough. "Eleanor," he said, his voice quiet but firm. She turned to him, a questioning look on her face. "There's something else," he said, standing up. "Another place I need to show you. Tomorrow." A look of gentle curiosity came into her eyes. "Another place where?" "You'll see," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "It's not a place for looking back. It's a place for looking forward." The next day was a Sunday. bright and clear and cold. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue, and the air was so crisp it felt like it could shatter. After the morning church service, which they attended together, sitting side by side in a pew, a silent but definitive statement to the entire town, he helped her into his wagon. But instead of taking the road toward her cottage, he turned the horses onto a less traveled track that led up into the low hills on the western edge of his own property. They rode in silence, the only sound the rhythmic clopping of the horses' hooves and the creak of the wagon wheels. The path grew steeper, and the valley of Harmony Creek spread out below them, a patchwork of autumn browns and golds. After a 10-minute climb, he pulled the horses to a halt on a wide, flat ledge of land. Before them, bathed in the bright afternoon sun, stood a house. It was not a large house, but it was perfect. It was built of sturdy, honey-colored pine, with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and one side. It had 3 large windows facing out, positioned to catch the morning sun and the breathtaking view of the valley below. The roof was made of cedar shakes, and a simple, elegant chimney of river stone rose from one end. It was finished, every last board and nail. There was no clutter of construction, no raw, unfinished edges. It looked as though it had been waiting there for years. Eleanor stared, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked from the house to Luke, her eyes wide with a question she didn't seem to know how to ask. "What is this?" she finally whispered. Luke's gaze was fixed on the house, his expression full of a history she didn't yet know. "It's a foolish boy's dream," he said softly. "I started it the summer before you left. I'd work on it after my chores were done. Sometimes by moonlight, I had this picture in my head of a life, of our life." He looked at her then, and she saw the old pain in his eyes, but it was a pain softened by the present. "When you were gone, I couldn't touch it. For 7 years, it just stood here, a half-finished skeleton, a monument to what I'd lost. I never thought I'd finish it." He hopped down from the wagon and came around to her side, holding up his hands to help her down. She took them, her legs feeling unsteady as she stepped onto the solid ground. He kept hold of her hands, his grip warm and steady. "When you came back," he continued, his voice growing stronger, "I didn't know what to do, but after that first night we talked, in your cottage, I came back up here the next morning, and I started working again. Every spare moment I had. I was up here, finishing it. It was an act of faith, I suppose. A hope that the future I'd thought was dead might just be waiting to be built." He led her up the 3 wide steps and onto the porch. He ran his hand along the smooth, sanded wood of the railing. "It's a good house, strong foundation. The view is, well, the view speaks for itself." He looked out over his land, the rolling pastures of Timber Ridge, the distant ribbon of the creek, the tiny cluster of buildings that was Harmony Creek. Then he looked back at her. His eyes were shining with an emotion so deep, so profound. It made her heart ache. "It's just a house right now, Eleanor," he said, his voice thick with meaning. "It's waiting for the woman who will make it a home." He released one of her hands and reached into the pocket of his coat. He pulled out a small, velvet-wrapped object. His hand was trembling slightly as he unwrapped it. Resting in his rough, calloused palm was a simple gold ring. It was worn with age, and set with a single, small pearl that glowed with a soft, inner light. "It was my mother's," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She gave it to me before she passed. She told me to give it to the woman I couldn't imagine a single day of my life without." And then, on the porch of the house he had built for her, with the entire valley as his witness, Luke Harlan dropped to one knee. He looked up at her, his heart in his eyes, all the love and the loss and the hope of a lifetime converging in this one perfect, terrifying, beautiful moment. He held up the ring. "Eleanor Duval," he said, his voice clear and steady. "Will you marry me?" The cold, clear air on the hilltop seemed to hold its breath. The entire world, the vast expanse of the valley below. The endless blue of the sky above shrank to the space on the porch of the unfinished house. It was a world composed of a man on one knee, a woman's heart caught in her throat, and a small, worn gold ring that held the weight of 2 lifetimes. Eleanor looked down at Luke, and in his upturned face, she saw everything. She saw the ghost of the passionate, reckless boy who had met her in secret in the aspen grove. She saw the hard, solitary man he had been forced to become, his face etched with the lines of lonely labor and unspoken grief. And she saw the man before her now, his love for her shining in his eyes. A love that had not only survived 7 years of silence and sorrow, but had been forged in that fire, emerging stronger, purer, and more certain than she could have ever dreamed. Tears, which had been so close to the surface, finally spilled over. They were not the tears of sorrow she had shed in the grove, but tears of a joy so profound, so overwhelming. It felt like a physical release. It was the breaking of a dam that had held back a 7-year flood of hope, of longing, of a future she had never dared to believe was possible. He waited, his expression a mixture of hope and terror. As she struggled to find her voice, she could not form the simple, single word that he was waiting for. A simple yes felt entirely inadequate. It was a word too small to contain the journey that had brought them to this moment. She wanted him to know, to understand the full truth of her return, the entire purpose of her heart. She reached out, her trembling fingers gently touching his cheek, the rough stubble a wonderfully real and solid thing beneath her palm. "Luke," she whispered, her voice a ragged, tear-choked thing. She took a breath, trying to steady herself, trying to give voice to the monumental truth that was overflowing within her. "When I stepped off that train, I wasn't just coming back to Harmony Creek." She shook her head, the tears flowing freely now. "I came back to find you." She saw the tension in his shoulders ease, the fear in his eyes begin to recede, replaced by a dawning, radiant joy. "I didn't know if you'd still be here," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "I didn't know if you would hate me. I didn't know if you had moved on, if you had a wife, a family. I didn't know anything, except that I had to see you again. I had to know. My life in Charleston. It was just waiting. I was waiting to be free so I could come back here." She gave a watery, breathless laugh. "I came back to find you, Luke Harland. And now that I have—" She looked from his face to the house he had built, to the valley that stretched out before them. Their valley, their future. "I'm staying to start a life with you." It was the only answer she could give. It was more than a yes. It was a vow. It was the closing of one chapter and the opening of another, all in a single breath. A slow, brilliant smile spread across Luke's face, a smile of such pure, unadulterated relief and happiness that it transformed him, erasing the last shadows of the lonely man he had been. He let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for 7 years. Without waiting for another word, he took her left hand in his, with a reverence that made her heart ache. He slid the small, precious ring, his mother's ring, onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. It felt as though it had been waiting for her, just as the man who placed it there had been, just as the house that surrounded them had been. He stood up then, rising to his full height, and pulled her into his arms. He held her tight against him, burying his face in her hair, and she clung to him, her tears soaking the rough fabric of his coat. They stood there on the porch, wrapped in an embrace that was both a reunion and a beginning, a silent testament to a love that had refused to die. The house was no longer just a house. In that moment, with their 2 hearts beating as one within its sturdy frame, it had become a home. The news of their engagement spread through Harmony Creek not like a wildfire, but like the warm, welcome light of a sunrise. When they rode back into town that afternoon, Eleanor sitting close beside him on the wagon seat, her hand resting proudly on his arm, the ring on her finger catching the light, the town saw them not as a source of gossip, but as a source of joy. It was the happy ending to a story they had all felt a part of. Martha Gable, Seeing them pass, was seen to dab at her eyes with the corner of her apron, a broad, satisfied smile on her face. They were married the following spring, on a day when the valley was bursting with new life. The snow had melted from the high peaks, the creek was running full and fast, and the first wild crocuses were pushing their way through the damp earth. The ceremony was held in the small white church at the center of town. It wasn't a grand affair, but it was perfect. The entire town was there, filling the simple wooden pews. They were not merely spectators, they were witnesses. The collective family that had watched this hard-won love find its way back home. Eleanor wore a simple dress of cream-colored lace, and in her hair, she had woven a few of the early spring wildflowers. Luke, standing at the altar, looked impossibly handsome and impossibly nervous in a new suit, his eyes never leaving her as she walked down the aisle on the arm of a beaming Silas Abernathy. Diego stood beside Luke as his best man, his weathered face split by a grin of pure, unadulterated pride. When the preacher asked them to say their vows, their voices were clear and strong, ringing with a certainty that left not a dry eye in the church. They exchanged rings, simple gold bands that symbolized a promise that had already been tested by time and fire. And when the preacher finally declared them man and wife, and Luke kissed his bride, the little church erupted in a cheer that seemed to shake the very rafters. They built their life in the house on the hill, the house that overlooked the valley and the ranch that was their shared legacy. The first years were a blur of hard work and simple, profound happiness. Timber Ridge flourished under their joint care. Luke's strength and knowledge of the land, combined with Eleanor's sharp mind and careful management of their finances, made them a formidable team. The house, once just a structure of wood and stone, became a home filled with the sounds of life. A year after their wedding, the sound of a baby's cry echoed in its rooms. A son they named Samuel, after Luke's father. 2 years later, a daughter followed, a girl with her mother's brown eyes and her father's stubborn spirit, whom they named Rose. Life was not always easy. There were harsh winters and dry summers. There were sick cattle and failed crops. But they faced every challenge together, their love a steady, unwavering anchor in the unpredictable currents of life. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching their children play in the yard as the sun set, their hands intertwined, often not needing to speak, their comfortable silence a language all its own. One cool summer evening, many years after their wedding, when Samuel was a sturdy boy of 10 and Rose was a bright, curious girl of 8, Luke took his family down to the creek. He carried a small bundle of saplings, their roots wrapped in burlap. They walked to the aspen grove, their sanctuary, which was now more beautiful than ever. Together, as a family, they planted the young trees along the bank of the creek, extending the grove, their hands working together in the rich, dark earth. "Why are we planting more trees?" Papa Rose asked, her small face serious. Luke looked at Eleanor over the heads of their children, a shared, knowing smile passing between them. He knelt down, placing his hands on his daughter's shoulders. "Because this is a special place. Rosie," he said, his voice soft, "this is where it all began. This is where your mother and I first fell in love." He pointed to the older, taller trees. "Those trees are our story. They remember everything." He then pointed to the small, new saplings they had just planted. "And these," he said, his gaze shifting to include his son, "these are for you. They are the start of your story, a new beginning." They stayed there until twilight, the 4 of them, sitting by the water's edge, listening to the timeless murmur of the creek and the whispering of the aspen leaves. The children laughed and skipped stones across the water's surface, their joy a bright, beautiful melody. Luke put his arm around Eleanor, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. A feeling of peace so deep and complete, it felt as though it had settled into her very bones. She looked at the grove, at the old trees and the new, at the man beside her, at the children who were their future. This was the place where her heart had first been given, The place where it had been broken, and the place where, against all odds, it had been made whole again, bound forever to the quiet cowboy who had never, not for a single day, stopped loving her. Thank you so much for listening to our story today. We'd love to know where you're listening from, so please drop a comment below to say hello and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. Your support, especially by hitting the hype button, helps our story reach more listeners and allows us to continue bringing these tales to you.